So welcome to the LCDC seminar. Welcome to the ones online. I hope this setup works. We're going to share the screen in a minute. So today we have Olga with us, the speaker. Olga is an assistant professor at the Department of Property at the University of Auckland, and also new amazing director, one of the directors, assistant director of Quaker. That's very exciting. Today, Olga is going to be talking about international mitigation frameworks and what we can learn from that work that she's done with other people, that what we can do in New Zealand. So I'll just pass it over to Olga.
Hey. So thanks for the introduction, Christina. Thank you to everyone to hear this presentation. So Catalina is just going to share the screen as well. Earlier this year, we have completed work that's fed into the review of our framework. And work was commissioned by Andy, and this wasn't done just by myself. I had a strong team with Professor John Hopkins, the professor of law at the University of Canterbury, and probably all know Professor Jason Bingham from the University of Auckland. So just to give you a bit of a background on the work that we did and the report that we wrote. So we all know that currently our earthquake-prone system framework is under 2017. We have enacted the Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Act, and territorial authorities were busy assessing potentially earthquake-prone buildings in their territorial authorities. They've been issuing notices, but clearly there were some issues with the way the program was being implemented, and we have heard a lot on the news that building owners are struggling with the cost of retrofit. So the program was going to be reviewed 10 years from its implementation in 2027, but that has been brought forward by the government, and in April last year they have announced that they are going to initiate that review. And so from that announcement, all building owners who have current notices that haven't been yet expired then received a 4-year extension to their remediation deadlines. So just also, I don't know how much you know, but probably you do, but it always is worth reminding how our earthquake-prone building system works, so that you have that in the background when I am reviewing programs from other jurisdictions. So essentially, it starts with our territorial authorities, who are, again, inventorying the potentially earthquake-prone buildings. We have 3 categories of buildings: unreinforced masonry buildings, then all buildings 9 to 76 that are more than 2 stories or 3 stories, 3 or more stories, and then there's another 39 to 35 buildings that are not URM buildings. We also have different zones of risk zones, high, medium, and low, and that those zones, the reasons we have them is that the mitigation timeframes vary depending on which risk zone you're in. So once the territorial authority inventoried potentially earthquake-prone buildings, then they notify building owners who work with engineers to assess and determine the percentage of the new building standard. And if that percentage NBS is less than 34%, then basically these buildings are given a deadline. Which, yes. They can move. Sorry. Hopefully this will be better. Okay. Sorry.
Thank you.
So just to recap, we have a mandatory system for a wide range of buildings. And we don't differentiate by building types in terms of the timelines. The only differentiation is then by the risk zone maturing. So I guess that's important to keep in mind of how other jurisdictions deal with their own potential. So from our report, we have spent a lot of time reviewing programs in the United States and in particular in California, and that's because they have depth of experience and available about their programs, but we have also looked at Japan and next one. So given that we have spent a lot of time looking at California experience, I just wanted to pay a bit more attention and recap of what we have uncovered in our research. So the way California deals with earthquake-prone buildings is the local ordinances. Every local territorial authority, equivalent of what we have here, their local authority will be implementing ordinance targeting a specific building type. So their first attempt at enacting some sort of statewide legislation was the URM law. And that was signed into law in 1986. So the URM law applied, it was a trade-off because there were early attempts at implementing this equivalent of URM law, but the trade-off that they finally agreed on is that it applied to zone risk 4, that is the highest zone risk, and in California it's really zone risk 3 and 4. And so it was only those authorities that were in zone risk 4 that were covered by this URM law. I guess it's no surprise that in California, it was the URM law that provided the URM buildings. It's the first type of buildings that they wanted to address, really, because they were designed in order sort of formal building codes and considerations, seismic capacity. But before the URM law, there were other cities in California that were pioneers of implementing mandatory programs, parking program buildings. And those Long Beach was the first in 1970s, and then LA implemented their program in 1981. And essentially, the URM law was kind of modeled under what they called with the ordinance that was implemented in LA. So, following the URM law, there was no other statewide legislation. Since then, the local authorities started implementing programs for other building types, but not because there was a state mandate to do it. It was more that they saw a huge big need in the area and resources, then they were implementing it. And it wasn't straight away, like URM law was signed in 1986. But the next building type that they started to address is kind of the self-storage wood buildings. That those ordinances in communities. And look at the statistics, I think it was only 14 active mandatory programs that focusing on self-storage. And they're slowly starting to look at concrete buildings as well. For mandatory programs, they're all clustered around LA. So it's LA, West Hollywood, Torrance County, and Santa Monica. And San Francisco just this year implemented an ordinance that requires mandatory screening of concrete buildings. So it's a step towards probably retrofitting concrete buildings, but not yet a requirement to be mandatory. So They have developed voluntary standards for kids, but at the moment it's just free. So you can see already kind of some patterns starting to emerge. They kind of, the approach was staged. They didn't attempt to look at all buildings at once. You are building them as they learn and gained experience and confidence and public awareness of risk mitigation. Other problems started to emerge. So some statistics from the URM law, because local authorities were required to report to the California Seismic Safety Commission every year. That's why they have very good statistics and records of how that URM program was implemented. So there were about 365 jurisdictions in California, so 4, but it's only 260 jurisdictions that actually had URM buildings. So, or implemented URM programs. And that covered 98% of all URM stores in California, which is not bad percentage. So from that, we can see that around half of the jurisdictions implemented mandatory programs. But again, even though it's only half, that still captured 3/4 of the URM business. And from the 2006 report, so this would be the jurisdictions under the URM law had to inventory their buildings by 1990. And in 2006, that was the last report by the Seismic Safety Commission. They reported that around 70% rate of seismic mitigation was achieved over that time. And some of it was with demolitions, but majority less working in retrofits. But if you look at more recent statistics in some of the larger cities like LA, San Francisco, they're pretty much in season. In terms of the URM law, no, it was a statewide law, zone 4 statewide mandate. The only thing that it mandated is local authorities to develop a program. And step 1, inventory the buildings, and step 2, create a program. They didn't say you have to have a mandatory retrofit program. It was actually left up to the local jurisdictions to decide whether they implement mandatory program, voluntary training program. They could just simply notify the owners that you have a hazardous building and leave it at that. Or there was some form of other tax which should be a combination of any of the above. But from the statistics, we can see that mandatory programs, they have achieved the highest rate of risk mitigation. Overall, 70% of the buildings within the E7 that was more. Within the total retrofit, 70% retrofits more within programs of mitigation. So clearly, this mandatory the most effective, but they also come with a lot of demolitions. Voluntary can still achieve some compliance, but it has to be supported back up with incentives. Otherwise, you can see that demolition rates are lower in areas that have voluntary. Just given that we have a lot of engineers in the audience, and that was section that Jason completed, so I will mention briefly on how buildings are, to what standard they were kind of retrofitted. So if you read any local ordinance, there will be a reference to either ASCE standard or EBC standard. And what is an EBC standard? Essentially, There is an international existing building code, which then California made an adaptation of that and made the Californian existing building code. And then each local authority would adopt their own existing building code based on the California building code with kind of their own flavor. So that's why in the ordinance, it would be either mentioned, say, if you look at Cisco ordinance, it would be certain standard meeting the San Francisco existing building code, or it would be LA existing building code, or meeting a code from the ASC, which of course has some links to the NZSC, which is kind of great to see a collaboration happening. So we also found that to show the compliance, generally it's to a high standard that what with certain buildings. Well, you already found that it is approximately what we want in terms of NPS, translating about 3.4%. But for other buildings, it's has to be 75% strength capacity. So I guess we already see some differences. What we haven't found is any sort of references to what we have here in the percentages. Essentially, when a local authority classifies a building that's potentially earthquake prone, it could be just hazardous buildings. Hazardous buildings, if you own a building, you're a hazardous building. Once you meet the requirements of the ordinance, you are no longer hazardous building. The inventory. There is no shade of gray of your highways, walkways, walkways. It's very black and white, hazardous or not. The other sort of reference to some sort of grades is the US Resilience Council, but the uptake there is very low because it's really just there's a badge to show off. It's kind of like the building concept now. It's really, of course, if you have a hazardous building, you not want to provide request for badges. So owners who have done it and completed retrofits and have paid some sort of resilience council star rating. Hopefully, they can still hear us online. All right, so now I will move on. Now that you have background on California, New Zealand, I'll kind of contrast that with what's happening also in Japan and Taiwan.
Hopefully now the audience here can hear me. All right, so on the next few slides, what I'm going to do is just highlight some differences between what they have in California, Japan, and Taiwan. So in California, as you already heard, in terms of the primary legislation, there is not one single act that covers all the state of California. The only act they have is the URM law, which didn't even cover the whole state. It only covered zone 4 of the state. All of the other kind of initiatives to implement any sort of retrofit programs, it's at the local level. In Japan, they have an act on promotion of seismic retrofit of buildings. And in Taiwan, they have 2 programs. First, it was big focus on just the public buildings. And since 2019, they've been looking also into private buildings. Now in California, well, in Japan and Taiwan, I should say, really the what initiated this their legislation was, of course, the devastating earthquakes. In Japan, it was the Kobe earthquake, which the same year they implemented the act. And in Taiwan, it was the Chichi earthquake of '99. So it was these earthquakes that then led to these acts. Whereas in California, there wasn't, well, of course, they were learning from earthquakes, but the URM law followed in 1986, whereas really it was the, I guess, the lessons of the Long Beach earthquake of 1933, and which that earthquake itself led to some serious kind of acts that were implemented, the Riley Act and the Field Act, which essentially outlawed any URM buildings being constructed. As far as how they define their earthquake-prone buildings, as I already mentioned, in California, that would be your hazardous building if you are of a certain construction type. So you're either URM building or a soft story wood frame or a non-ductile concrete building, and you built in a particular time frame. So for example, for soft story buildings, that was usually pre-1978, 1980s, and similar age category for concrete building, end of 1970s. In Japan, in Kobe earthquake, what they found is that 97% of buildings or houses that collapsed, they were built pre-1981. So that's why their focus there is on pre-1981 buildings. And what they use there is so-called IS index. So that's their structural seismic score. And in Taiwan, they revised their code after the Chichi earthquake. So all buildings pre that earthquake essentially are part of their legislation that they fall under kind of earthquake-prone building legislation. So within the scope of covered buildings, again, it's in California, it doesn't cover all buildings all at once. It's specific building typologies. In Japan, they don't really differentiate by the type of building construction. It's more by the categories or the use of buildings. And here in this list I download, they categorize buildings into 23 types. And they're mainly based on purpose, whether that building is a gymnasium or a school or a hospital, a theater. And there are kind of different requirements for some of them. It's more than 1 story and 5,000 square meters, some of them more than 3 story and 5,000 square meters. So it's quite a complicated system there. And it covers all the public buildings, private buildings with commercial and industrial use, but with some sort of public access into them. Residential buildings aren't covered by this act, but if you fall on an emergency route, then residential buildings would be covered by that act. However, the Japan Act has opened kind of doors for local authorities to develop some sort of incentive programs and targets to also incentivize retrofit of residential buildings. For Taiwan, with their first program, they really focused on public buildings. And over the period of 2009 to 22, they have retrofitted over, well, around 9,500 buildings. They have demolished a few as well, but you can see on the kind of percentages, they have investigated and assessed 31,000 buildings that were public buildings. Out of those, around 12,000 needed to be seismically strengthened or demolished. And so you can see in these percentages, they have achieved quite high rates there, success. Now, the second part of the legislation that they just recently, well, 2019, they enacted that program that covers private buildings over a certain number of stories, and they're typically reinforced construction, reinforced concrete, sorry. Okay. Oh, yeah, just next slide. Yes, thank you. So for performance standards, I already mentioned that about California, it's kind of 75% strength capacity. I couldn't find some sort of reference to a percentage for Japan, but what they do have is this seismic index, the IS index that they have, and it's different levels depending on the use of the building. For your typical private building, it would be 0.6, which they describe it as very low possibility of collapse in a very strong earthquake. They call it level 2 design load, which probably engineers speak can understand that. For public buildings, if it's a critical buildings, it has to be remain functionable and no damage. But for kind of low level public buildings, but still important, they need to be repairable, can be some damage, but still be functionable. And in Taiwan, they require, well, at least life safety, because they do allow targeted retrofit, just the kind of first story weak layer in the building. But if you're doing a full retrofit for a building, for a private building, they expect 80%. And for critical facilities, again, it's similar to Japan. They expect functionality there. And whether it's required, the retrofit's mandatory, voluntary. In California, it varies. Mandatory, there is a range of different programs, no consistent kind of black and white approach there. But in Japan, there is no mandatory requirement to strengthen. They have mandatory evaluation, but strengthening is, they still achieve high rates of strengthening, and it's probably really due to cultural differences because the government sets a target. They expect by 2025, we're gonna have 100% or nearly 100% achieve seismic resilience in our buildings. And somehow that is enough of a driver for owners to act on that. For Taiwan, with the government program, you have seen the rates there. Obviously, government financed that whole thing, so it was nearly 100% there. But for private buildings, it's the only mandatory component there is that they have to be screened. All of the reinforced concrete pre-2000 buildings have to be screened. And then they have this stepped approach. If it's screened and it revealed some deficiencies, then it will require mandatory assessment, and then they will encourage you to retrofit. Again, for private buildings in Taiwan, there is no mandatory requirement to retrofit. What is the trigger for assessment? Well, in California, within local ordinances, it would be the age of construction and the building typology. In Japan, it's the period of construction and also whether or not you are on the emergency evacuation route. And in Taiwan, the trigger is if you build pre-2000. For the retrofit deadlines in California, it varies by building type. For URM buildings, on average, 10 years. Top story, because it was targeted retrofits only to the first story, ground floor. They expected it to be done 3 to 7 years. And for concrete buildings programs that are being implemented now, given the cost of retrofitting these buildings, it's 20 to 25 years. In Japan, it's all done indirect through policy goals. And in Taiwan, well, by 2022, they've achieved 92% rates of retrofit for public buildings. But there's no deadline for private buildings. And honestly, for Taiwan, it's still quite a long road before they'll finish, make a big dent in their private building sector. Because with the mandatory programs in California, enforcement depends on how the local ordinance is structured, but typically it's fines. And if you fail to retrofit by the deadline, the local the city has an authority to enter the building and demolish, basically. So in LA, for example, for URM buildings, it was the order for demolition would be after 90 days. Long Beach was really hard on building owners, and they have demolished quite a few buildings there. So it probably served as a good example for others if they don't do anything. In Japan, again, there is no mandatory strengthening. It's all mandatory assessment and evaluation. So really, it's the enforcement is purely through social pressure, and it's basically public disclosure. This example from Tokyo, oh no, it's from Osaka. That's just they always publish lists and updates the percentages of buildings that have been retrofitted. In Taiwan, again, public buildings, that thing is done. For private, they don't really publish lists of problematic buildings. Really, they're just trying to be positive about it. And the way they approach it is that they show how much they have achieved today, rather than saying how much problematic buildings we have. So every few months they publish. So currently, that's a snippet from their current newsletter, like 143 buildings in the program. And so that's pretty much the way they promote their progress. And how they disclose the risk to the public. Well, a lot of local authorities in California would have publicly available lists, and a lot of them would also require public posting. So to make sure that public, kind of similar to our EPB notices, just to let the public know that it's an earthquake-prone building. In Japan, they publish these lists, and in Taiwan, it's more about publishing buildings that have been retrofitted and making those buildings public. Financial incentives, it's actually quite a range. In what I found in the US, historic buildings qualified for a specific tax credit, and that's at the federal level. It's not just specific to California. Any historic retrofit building can qualify for the credit. There are some FEMA grants, but as you know, with the current political environment, they are cutting a lot of funding there. In California, what exists is the property rates freeze. So it basically, as long as you own the buildings, your rates aren't going to increase based on the uplift in the value. And some of the local authority have low interest loans, or they can put on the cost of retrofit onto the property rates assessment. And then the way you pay off that retrofit cost is through your rates assessment bill, rather than the mortgage payment made to the bank. Because in Japan and Taiwan, they have no mandatory strengthening requirements, they do provide a lot of incentives to the private building owners. And as far as the seismic rezoning, again, in California, it's just the highest risk zone. But in Japan and Taiwan, it's a nationwide program. There is no differentiation by risk. Just quickly mention what we have found in other countries or jurisdictions. Turkey and Mexico don't have any mandatory strengthening programs. Most of it is done during post-disaster reconstruction or retrofit, and a lot of it is achieved through receiving aid from international aid agencies. So and again, the focus is, of course, on public buildings. So there is example of retrofits of schools in Mexico. In Istanbul, they currently have a program going since 2006, where they retrofitted or rehabilitated over 1,600 buildings, public buildings. Again, this is funded through the World Bank and by some other agencies as well. But for private buildings, there is nothing really mandatory or even voluntary that exist. They have this urban transformation law in Turkey, which really encourages urban renewal. And it's really directed very strongly towards demolition and really refreshing their building stock. And in Italy, again, the only program that we have found is based on the tax incentives, and that's the SISMA bonus. Essentially, you can claim up to 48,000 euros in tax credit, which is spread over a 5-year period. So now just to quickly go through, based on what you have learned from these different programs, what have we found to be kind of effective and things that we may consider bringing into New Zealand? So we have seen that there's been really big focus on retrofitting public buildings and other kind of important buildings. So probably directing some of our attention to that area is helpful. And that has been done and achieved in many countries that we have looked at. Another thing that we have found that I guess has helped with the retrofits in California at least is differentiating the regulations by building typology. So instead of biting everything at once, it's kind of dividing it and making it more manageable. So as I have already explained, the way California has gone is they first looked at URM buildings, followed by soft story, and now they're targeting concrete buildings. But it also helps that if you're looking at a single building typology, you can tailor the time frames. So clearly, depending on building kind of complexity, you can make timelines shorter or longer, but you can also create different risk categories. So in URM, a lot of times it was based on number of occupants. In soft story, based on the number of residential units in them, whereas in concrete buildings is based on size of the building, number of stories. So again, having this typology kind of helps make it more manageable. And it also helps with, obviously, getting some experience and making sure actually the construction sector and engineers have enough capacity to deliver the retrofits. Another, I guess, successful approach that we found in some of the examples in California is allowing some sort of staged or incremental retrofits. So for example, in URM buildings in LA, if you install anchors in the first years, then you have a lot longer time frame, a much longer time frame to complete the full retrofit of the building. Whereas if you don't have anchors, you have much less time to do it. Currently with the West Hollywood concrete building ordinance, again, they staged it where you address major deficiencies in the first, I think, 15 years, and then you do the full retrofit over the remaining 10 years. In Taiwan, they have this plan A and plan B. So essentially you can do the weak story retrofit, and then if you decide to maybe do the whole building as well. And so from that, I guess we can think of, well, what is the acceptable trade-off? If we can achieve, I don't know, 80% risk reduction at 50% cost, can we live with that? And so some of the retrofit methods, solutions, they don't give you functionality or even life safety. They just simply prevent the building from collapse. So question for us, can we live with that for some building types? And so in California, the program that's been very popular there, or somewhat popular, is Bolts Plus, where it's really just fastening the parapet and tying facade, I guess. So if that makes programs more affordable, again, should we consider that? And there is some work already happening with this simple strengthening here for New Zealand URM buildings. Borrowing from the example in California, our approach is just a blanket approach. Everyone has to have a mandatory program, but the URM law gave each local authority a choice to consider their political environment, their economic environment, social context, to decide whether they develop a mandatory program or voluntary program. So something, again, clearly regional centers in New Zealand are struggling with this. If we're gonna have a mandatory program, we have to be able to monitor it. I think the way we have structured at the moment, we've given a letter to the owner, and depending on what risk zone, 15 years, 35 years later, we're gonna ask the building owner whether or not they strengthen the building. But for example, in local ordinances in California, they have very structured timelines for different steps in implementing and getting towards retrofit. And the local authorities would report on how many building owners have complied with each of those steps. So I think it's very important, if you're going to have a program, to have this kind of rigorous way to monitor the progress and making sure that it's quite clearly stipulated within the legislation. So that was the California example, but that's example, say, from Tokyo. They report, what is that, every 6 months, they'll tell you what the rate of retrofit has been, how much it has increased. They show you the map of the rates of retrofits. Yeah, so they do keep track and making sure that we're ticking towards the goal. Possibly something we can consider is some sort of dedicated authority that will look after our earthquake-prone buildings. In Taiwan, they have a National Center for Research on Earthquake Engineering. They were looking after the implementation of the strengthening of public buildings, and now they're looking after the private buildings, and they develop different kind of retrofit solutions and they do a lot of case studies and promote retrofits and so on. So they're really engaged and try to engage public and engineers. And in California, of course, we had during the URM law, especially active California Seismic Safety Commission. Another important aspect is before you implement a program, it's really important to do good research on potential retrofit solutions and what they're going to cost, because it's really important. It's easy to implement a mandatory program, but if you don't know whether or not your building owners are going to struggle, it's what we're experiencing now. Pretty much all the big cities in California has done big $1 million+ studies on earthquake retrofit solutions. In Taiwan, it was a 10-year period preparation towards implementing their public building retrofits. So again, we shouldn't rush. What you hear from a lot of building owners is that they are not sure if the goalpost will move after they retrofit. And so at least one assurance we can give them is an exemption from retrofits, and it's explicitly written in a lot of ordinances in California that for 15 years, you're going to be exempt from any future retrofits. So that's a good peace of mind for building owners. It's also been found that a lot of mitigation programs stalled if there was insufficient engagement and consultation with stakeholders before the program was implemented. So again, it's important to understand how will building owners implement it, whether we'll have bank financing on board, what will insurers think of this program, and whether there is political appetite to implement it as well. So it's important to take time in that area as well. And financial support. financial support is needed because it's kind of universal that it's expensive to retrofit, and private building owners do need some sort of support. I've already given examples of what exists in California. They don't really have grants, but they kind of enable it through low interest loans or property rates assessments. But of course, in areas where there is no mandatory programs, there are significant financial incentives. So just to quickly wrap up, where to from here, just the big highlights. What I thought is New Zealand is quite unique, and we were very ambitious in our nationwide program of mandatory strengthening. We are quite unique and stand out across the world. So in California, they were only able to achieve their URM law for Zone 4. I'll give you an example from Seattle, Washington. They've been trying to implement mandatory program just for URM buildings. They're not even considering any other building types there. Since 2012, they had their inventory, but so far they had no political appetite to implement a mandatory ordinance. They have all the different engineering solutions, but until they have figured out financial incentives, they're not prepared to implement that program. We've couldn't find any comparable parameters overseas analogous to our percentage NBS. It is quite black and white overseas. You are the hazardous or you are not hazardous. The retrofit standards have been found to be higher than what we have for the buildings overseas to be not hazardous. Degree of financial support, it varies by jurisdictions. And I would say that in California, you have seen that it's possible to implement mandatory program even without huge financial grants, but nevertheless, you do need make sure that banks are on board for this, because initially their banks as well, they were quite hesitant to lend on earthquake-prone buildings, but they have warmed up to this idea. But they also kind of enable certain favorable planning rules, or they do have ability to give low interest loans or pass the costs on to the tenants in your buildings. And yes, affordability is an issue everywhere, and we do need solutions for affordable retrofits. Yes, you can hear these kind of comments. California, Japan, it's quite similar. Building owners say the same thing. It's too expensive, and if we're going to do anything, we need money. Do it. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation.